I remind you that discernment is a discipline. It requires work to develop mental acuity. In fact, in one of the most well-known verses in the Bible about discernment, Hebrews 5:14 says, "Solid food is for the mature who by constant use have trained themselves to distinguish good from evil." Now, the word that's translated distinguish in that verse is the word for discern. And the Greek word in the New Testament that is translated that way has the idea that through the use of separating discrimination, a person makes judgments and decisions. And the equivalent word in the Old Testament that's used 247 times refers to the process by which one comes to know or understand God's thoughts and ways through separating those things that differ. And so with all of that, one has, I think, helpfully defined discernment this way. It's the divinely given ability to distinguish God's thoughts and ways from all others. My theology professor, the late Dr. Roland McCune, used to say that one of the greatest gifts God gave to humanity is the ability to correlate truth. And the Apostle Paul in Philippians chapter 1 in verse 9 said, "This is my prayer, that your love may abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight, so that you may be able to discern what is best and may be pure and blameless for the day of Christ." We want to exercise that God-given capacity well, and it's to that Discernment Digest is devoted. Now, going back nearly 4 months, I said to you, my advice, dear flock, is that you severely limit your intake to only those who can be trusted, that your earliest acts of discernment be to cut off those who lie by exaggeration or otherwise, and do so at the very first sign, that you cut off those who are immoral in their appearance and words at the earliest sign. Part of the way that we got where we now are in our country and, more importantly, in the Christian world is by failing to discern sources before we ever have to discern claims. We became willing to accept people whom we should viscerally reject, and then failing at that choice, we set ourselves up for buying into the intellectually false, the ethically bad, and the morally wrong. And so I've said we should probably pursue thinking better about less. In the words of the wisest man who ever lived, Solomon, in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, the words of the wise are like goads, their collected sayings like firmly embedded nails given by one shepherd. Be warned, my son, of anything in addition to them. Of making many books there is no end, and much study wearies the body. Of the making of many books there is no end, and as I've said, we can add to that of the making of many podcasts, of the making of many cable shows, all of the things that bombard us with claims and truth claims. So we need to be very judicious in the way we choose who and what it is we are going to listen to. And so each week we offer a digest of issues with the aim of demonstrating discernment in the way that we think about them. The objective is not to tell you what to think about most issues, but rather how to think about them. Now, I say I'm not trying to tell you what to think about most issues. I use the word most because matters about which God has spoken in His Word, He has told us what we must think about those, and we must agree with Him, of course. But most issues do not have a direct chapter and verse in the Bible, and therefore we must exercise the wisdom of discernment. And on those that we're interested in talking about, we want to do so in learning how better to think rather than what to think. How to think rather than what to think. So, we are at war with Iran. But the conduct of this war is the strangest I have ever seen, as our policy for it is announced by the president via social media almost daily, and it changes almost daily. Yes, we've had diplomatic discussions about conditions for peace and ceasefires and the like, including Vice President Vance leading a delegation to Pakistan week before last, but unfortunately coming home without any agreement. And just 2 days ago, this past weekend, we were supposed to be sending another delegation to Pakistan, but the president canceled the day that they were set to leave. They being not the vice president and not our Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, but instead a man appointed by the president to be our country's special envoy to the Middle East. That's his title, a man named Steve Witkoff, whose background is as a real estate investor. And he was to be accompanied by Jared Kushner, whose background is son-in-law of the president. Now, to be fair, Kushner has led other negotiations for us in the president's first term, and he appears to have some ability. But it is curious that the Secretary of State is not involved. In any case, as I said, the trip for Witkoff and Kushner was canceled by the president at the last minute. Now, there is a school of thought regarding President Trump that he's a genius who is a master negotiator and deal maker. I think going back to his book, best-selling book, many decades ago now, The Art of the Deal, and his real estate experience. But there is some mythology on that score, including his oft-made claim that he started in business by getting a loan from his father, which he paid back with interest, he makes sure to add. But the truth is, Donald Trump was given wealth by his dad. Donald Trump was already a millionaire as a teenager. He became a millionaire, in fact, by age 8 due to trust funds and income from his father, Fred Trump. By the time he was a teenager and in his late teens and early 20s, his reported net worth was over $3 million. By age 3, he was receiving an income of $200,000 a year in today's dollars. He was a millionaire by age 8. Shortly after graduating from college, his net worth was estimated at $3.2 million, and he has received at least $413 million in today's dollars from his father over his lifetime. And the man who ghost wrote The Art of the Deal, a man named Tony Schwartz, says that Trump created a false myth of genius, saying instead that his style relies on hyperbole, relentless promotion, and playing people rather than strategic negotiation. Well, I do know that in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, Trump did in fact relentlessly play the media in New York with self-promotion, appearing on Howard Stern's radio program to talk about his sexual exploits, and apparently posing as his own business agent, an agent who would talk about how brilliant and wealthy his client, Trump, is. No kidding, a man named John Barron would say he was Trump's business associate, but for all the world, when this John Barron would call in and call into radio programs, there's one occasion where there appears to be a short snippet of him calling into C-SPAN. For all the world, this John Barron sounds like, you guessed it, Donald Trump. Now, you can hear the clips if you Google John Barron and Trump. And by the way, all of you know the name of Trump's youngest son, Barron. So it appears the deal-making may not be what many think it is. And I wouldn't care, really, except that genius mystique helped get him elected president. And it's persisted into his 2 terms as president that many believe he is such a genius that he plays 5-dimensional chess while mere mortals like the rest of us are playing checkers. And it gets really, really, really serious when applied to foreign policy and military operations. So given that we are at war, the president is setting policy and conducting the war in large part via social media. Let me review a good bit of what he has written and said the past 2 months about 3 things: victory in Iran, about our negotiations with Iran, and about the all-important Strait of Hormuz there. Here's what he said about victory in Iran, March 2nd. Quote, "We're already substantially ahead of our time projections. 2 days later, this is only just the beginning. 5 days after that, we wiped them out in the first 2 days. 2 days later, March 11th, we've won. Let me tell you, we've won. 2 days later, we've already destroyed 100% of Iran's military capability. A week later, we are very close to meeting our objectives, and that same day, he said, the war has been won. On March 24th, we won. In the first hour, it was over." On negotiations, on March 1st, he says, "I've agreed to talk, so I'll be talking to them. 5 days later, there will be no deal with Iran except unconditional surrender. March 20th, I don't want to do a ceasefire. March 30th, the United States is in serious discussions to end our military operations in Iran. That same day, Iran said, we have had no negotiations with America in these 31 days. On April 1st, Iran's new regime president has just asked, says Trump, the United States of America for a ceasefire. Same day, Iran says this is false and baseless. April 17, they've agreed to everything. It's a great deal. Iran says our enriched uranium is not going to be transferred anywhere. April 19, we're offering a very fair and reasonable deal. I hope they take it. And then President Trump on the Strait of Hormuz. On March 16, I'm demanding that these countries come in and protect their own territory. The next day, quote, we don't need any help. March 20, reopening the strait is a very simple military maneuver. The next day, if Iran doesn't fully open without threat the Strait of Hormuz within 48 hours from this exact point in time, the United States of America will hit and obliterate their various power plants. 2 days later, I will manage the Strait of Hormuz with the next Ayatollah. March 28, we are taking the strait back. It's guaranteed. March 31, it's not America's job to secure the Strait of Hormuz. The next day, when this conflict is over, the strait will open up naturally. On April the 5th, open the expletive strait, you crazy expletive, or you'll be living in hell, just watch. 2 days later, April 7, a whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. April 12, effective immediately, the United States Navy, the finest in the world, will begin the process of blockading any and all ships trying to enter or leave the Strait of Hormuz. April 17, the Strait of Hormuz is completely open and ready for business. As I speak, the Strait of Hormuz is closed. Now look, foreign policy and military strategy are above my pay grade. And most of the presidents in my lifetime never served in the military, unlike in decades before my time when most men had some experience in war, going back to World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam. But the first president for whom I was old enough to vote and did, Ronald Reagan, had no military experience. George H.W. Bush was a war hero in World War II. Bill Clinton dodged the Vietnam draft. George W. Bush, was in the Air National Guard. Obama had no military experience. And Trump was drafted for the Vietnam War, but he got a deferment due to bone spurs. So what do presidents do who have no real experience themselves in the military or in foreign policy? Well, they surround themselves with good people who do have that experience, and for the most part, they follow their advice. But this president appears to be running this himself overall. And I know we all agree that whoever is making those life and death and economic impact decisions needs to be wise. So I do hope our president is playing this five-dimensional chess while the rest are playing checkers. But there is also the real possibility that we should perhaps invoke something I mentioned weeks ago called Occam's razor. That says the most obvious explanation is usually the right one. And I hope I'm wrong about what is obvious to me. Speaking of putting capable people around you, the president nominated and the Senate confirmed Kash Patel to be the FBI director back in February of last year by a vote of 51 to 49. This past week, The Atlantic published an article quoting over a dozen current and former FBI employees saying that the FBI director has a massive alcohol problem, that there are times when he does not show up for work, times when he cannot be located, even a time when his security detail came close to breaking down the doors of his residence to determine whether he was in there. And all right. Now, these sources were all anonymous, and Patel says they're false, and this week he filed a $250 million defamation lawsuit against The Atlantic. Now, in order to win a defamation lawsuit, you have to prove that not only were the claims false, but that the reporter knew them to be false. So it's an almost impossible standard, and therefore I don't expect much to come of that. Now, whether it has any repercussions for Patel's tenure as FBI director, we're just going to have to wait and see whether the anonymous claims are corroborated with proof in the days and weeks ahead. The Atlantic reporter claims that she has been inundated with many more claims since the article came out. If that's so, I at least would expect that some of that will have proof, and there will be at least some on-the-record claims. So none of us knows whether what the article says is true or not. What I do know about Kash Patel is that he was the chief investigator for former Republican Congressman Devin Nunes, who was chairman of the House Oversight Committee. When Nunes was chairman, he was given reports by Kash Patel claiming that the Obama administration had spied on the Trump campaign and then the incoming Trump administration after the 2016 election, seeking to derail Trump's presidency before it began. Now, these were explosive claims, but these now, 10 years later, and with more people since making similar claims, people like Nunes' successor as chairman of the House Oversight Committee, James Comer, people like current Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, and just within the last 10 days, Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche has hired 2020 election denier and former Rudy Giuliani elite strike force attorney Joe DeGeneva to run point on looking into the same claims 10 years later. So far, no proof, including when Kash Patel made the claims a decade ago. Now, the Atlantic article and the multiple unsuccessful investigations of the Obama administration spying on the Trump people have something in common, namely, a hit piece in a newspaper or magazine, or an investigation into supposed wrongdoing on the part of government officials, neither of them have to be proven or even true to be effective in harming their targets. If the Atlantic piece is indeed a hit piece designed to destroy Kash Patel and perhaps force him to resign as FBI director or possibly be fired, and what would be the motivation? Well, perhaps some of those anonymous sources just don't like him. Let's say because they remember his role when he was working for Devin Nunes, and they accused the FBI of illegal activity. Perhaps some of those people resent that and have fed false information to a reporter. But even if it's false and there never is any proof, it still does damage. And that's why there is such a thing as a hit piece. They have their effect. And the same is true of investigations. The alleged wrongdoing does not have to be true, and it certainly does not ever have to be proven to have its negative effect, which unfortunately is why, especially these days, some investigations are undertaken, not because they're true or have any merit, but because they harm the accused just by being pursued. The Obama spying narrative is so ingrained in the minds of many Americans who heard about it, being the biggest scandal in the history of the country, as Sean Hannity repeatedly called it. And so it keeps getting trotted out, even though a special counsel, a man named John Durham, was appointed to look into this very thing. He spent 4 years and millions of dollars looking into it, and he came up with nothing. So do not believe anything from any source until it's proven, whether in court or with incontrovertible evidence, because bad actors seek to use journalists to do hit pieces on enemies. And bad actors in government seek to use the levers of government to do the same to their opponents. They don't have to prove the claims, but just make them. Get the headline, and the damage then is done because the questions are raised. And now, especially in the chaotic information environment we are now in, people forget about it in a day, let alone a week or months, and they only vaguely have in the back of their mind this notion that the other side are bad people. Now, yet another example was in the news this week when the complaint against the Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell was dropped by the U.S. attorney who filed it, someone named Jeanine Pirro. You may know her as Judge Jeanine from the Fox News Channel. You ever noticed how many former Fox personalities work for our government in this administration, including Dr. Oz, Pete Hegseth, and they're in very important positions. Oz is the administrator for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid. Hegseth is the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of War, who, by the way, fired yet another high-ranking official with whom he was at odds. And during a time of war, I might add, the Secretary of the Navy was fired by Hegseth this past week. Anyway, Judge Jeanine withdrew the complaint against Powell this week. But like hit pieces and bad faith investigations, truth and proof are not the point. The point is the headline, which is always much, much more prominent when the accusation is made. What happens after that, including if the case is withdrawn or if it's lost in court, that makes few headlines, and people have already moved on. I remember back in the days of the Reagan administration, his first Secretary of Labor was a man named Raymond Donovan. And Ray Donovan was accused of illegality. It went to court. He had to resign as the Secretary of Labor. The administration had to find someone else. It went on for the better part of 2 years. He was found not guilty. He was exonerated. And I remember him coming outside of the courthouse before the microphones, and the damage had already been done. And he asked outside of the court, quote, "To which office do I go to get my reputation back?" Michael Irvin is a Hall of Fame wide receiver who played for the Dallas Cowboys. He was falsely accused of sexual harassment, and after being cleared, he said to the press, "I want you to cover the exoneration with the same intensity you covered the accusation." But of course, that didn't happen, and it never does. People who exercise discernment see that claims can be made. They can even be recycled if they're popular. They need not be proven, and yet they do their damage. Those of us who demand proof before we conclude make it harder for those bad actors to get what they want. And so may our tribe increase. President Trump, in his first term, tried this very tactic a couple of times, very directly, as he asked for the investigations himself on a few occasions. One was his request of the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to announce, and I emphasize announce, that the Ukrainian government was opening an investigation into Joe Biden and his son Hunter. It was not so much the investigation itself he was after, but the announcement that one was underway. Investigations are sometimes done without announcing them, as most of you know. It wouldn't have to be announced, and it could take place if you're interested just in the investigation and finding out whether there's guilt or innocence, and I'm making no claim about that issue at all, just that the president, on a phone call that we have the transcript of, was asking, in the context, by the way, of weapons systems that we were supplying to Ukraine, "I need you to do us a favor, though," he said. And then he began to talk about this. And he did something similar after having lost the 2020 presidential election, but while he was still president for the 2 months between November of 20 and then Inauguration Day, January 20 of 2021, in an effort to stay in power because the election was supposedly rigged. And in a meeting with two top officials in the Justice Department, according to the contemporaneous notes that one of them took at the time, he asked them to, quote, just say the election was corrupt and leave the rest to me and the our congressman. So this Justice Department official in his notes wrote our congressman. Well, the our congressman stands for Republican congressman. Now, this was after their boss, the boss of these two Justice Department officials, the Attorney General, had told the president just days before that there were no irregularities in the 2020 election that would overturn the result, but he was still trying to spread that narrative. In fact, Attorney General Bill Barr resigned just a few days earlier rather than be fired during that lame duck 2 months. Going back decades before his time, going back to his time in New York, the president knows the power of headlines and how to control them. And he was seeking to do so in these two instances on a couple of very, very important issues. It's what hit pieces do. It's what corrupt politicians do. The truth of the matter is not what matters. It's the headline. People like Dr. Oz, Pete Hegseth, Kash Patel, Judge Jeanine, Todd Blanche, and, Robert Kennedy Jr., people like that close to the president do give me personally great concern. And one reason was demonstrated again this week when RFK was in the White House, in fact, in the Oval Office with several other administration officials, including Howard. Emails prove I went to Epstein Island after I denied ever doing so. Howard Lutnick, who is our Secretary of Commerce. So there was Lutnick and Dr. Oz and RFK Jr. and others, and they were gathered behind President Trump in the Oval Office this past week. And Trump once again was bragging about his information having lowered prices on some drugs by 600%. Well, that would mean you would be owed a refund, I guess, since it's impossible to lower a price on anything by more than 100%. A 100% reduction means the price is zero. So as you might imagine, the president was criticized for that false statement. But never fear, at that meeting, the Secretary of the Health and Human Services Department, RFK Jr., jumped in to defend the president's false math with some false math of his own, saying, with Trump nodding in agreement, and this is on video, so you can watch it, RFK says, quote, the Democrats were ridiculing President Trump for his math, saying it's mathematically impossible to have any drug drop by 600%. And I said, well, if the drug was $100 and the price was raised $600, that would be a $600 rise. And if it drops $600 to $100, that's a 600% savings. That's my best RFK. And Trump says that's right. And RFK says the president used that mathematical device to illustrate the magnitude of the savings. Illustrate the magnitude of the savings is equivalent to exaggerate to the point of either lying or demonstrating you have no idea how math works. In fact, a rise from $100 to $600 is a 500% increase, not 600. And a drop from 600 to 100 is an 83% decrease, not 600%. Percentage decreases over 100% are impossible without negative prices. So yeah, I'm concerned about people like the list I mentioned, to which more could be added, but even with the likes of RFK saying stupid stuff like that, he's perhaps not the worst person around the president, as long as Paula White is Trump's hand-picked director of the White House Faith Office. If you YouTube Paula White preaching, just be prepared for a shock. She looks certifiable in some of the videos. But Paula is a huge supporter of the president. And as I've said in recent episodes, she's compared him to Jesus. And that was apart from him comparing himself to Jesus in that infamous photo that he put on his social media feed. But something Paula White said will conclude today's podcast, but prepare for a topic I plan to cover next week. She and many other religious Trump supporters have said that Trump has been raised up by God because God says in Scripture he raises up people and he places them in positions of authority. It is God who raises up a king. So, says Paula, when you fight against the plan of God and his chosen man, you're fighting against the hand of God. Now, that may seem biblically plausible at first hearing, until you remember that, of course, that same thing equally applies to leaders like Obama and Biden. Didn't God raise them up too? And even a cursory reading of the Old Testament shows that God also raises up leaders to test and or punish his people. So there's that. So what we need is to distinguish. We need to discern between God's sovereign will and his moral will, a topic that I will take up next week. If you have any questions or comments, you can send those to discern@cbctrenton.com. I hope you can listen again next Monday. In the meantime, have a great week serving and discerning.